So, since I read the imaginative realism book that I reviewed, I started on a head sculpt to have as reference. I had been working on a 3D model of a head before that, but it's not done yet. So, I thought I'd take the chance to get back into sculpting. Plus, it's faster than 3D modeling for me still, and it's always nice to have something physical. I don't have a 3D printer, so I can't print any of the 3D models I make, but it's possible to turn a sculpt like this into a 3D model with just a camera and the right software. For now, I just want to do this sort of quick intro into polymer clay. In this part, I'm going to cover the different types, how to soften it, and how to bake it. The second part will cover armatures, the different ways to bulk them out, and the importance of reference. Finally, in the last part, I'll cover the different tools I use, how to blend clay, and a real-time demonstration of some of the techniques I use. First of all, regular polymer clay comes in all sorts of colors. I'm honestly not very familiar with these. They're better suited to things that don't require a lot of detail. If you want more info, I'll leave a link in the description to this very useful polymer clay encyclopedia where you can find all sorts of in-depth information. What I'm more familiar with is Super Sculpey, which is what most professional sculptors use. The regular Super Sculpey comes in this skin-like semi-translucent beige, but I've found its slight translucency makes it hard to see, and it tends to darken a lot when baked. Instead, I would recommend a gray clay. It's much easier to see details, and it also bakes to a much more consistent color that is easy to photograph. At the time when I bought my clay, only Super Sculpey Firm came in gray, and I ended up combining my block of Super Sculpey with a block of Super Sculpey Firm to get more of the workability of the regular one and the gray color of the Firm. Now they actually sell this mix pre-made as Super Sculpey Medium. I've also accidentally bought glow-in-the-dark Fimo clay once instead of white. The white is easier than the semi-translucent beige to work with, but I still prefer gray. And yes, the glow-in-the-dark does work. I mixed it into some of the gray clay, and now my head sculpt glows a bit as well. Now, as you might have gathered, polymer clay comes in different firmnesses, with the regular multicolored clays usually being softer and the more professional ones being harder, because the firmness determines how well the clay holds details. The harder the clay, the more detail, but they also get dry and brittle faster in storage. You can see my 5-year-old chunk of mixed Sculpey here has been in storage for a while, and it's hard as a rock. The good thing, though, is that you can soften it back up again so long as you never left it somewhere hot, because that would bake it. To do so, you can buy a softener that they sell, or you can use baby oil, and I double-checked this with Sculpey because I had my doubts, but they said it was the best alternative if you can't find the softener. I also did a few experiments myself, though, with different substances, and I'll go into more detail in my blog post if you're interested. To start, you need to cut your clay into small bits. Mine was already crumbled a bit in the bag. Some people put the big chunks in a bag and hammer them. I cut up all the large chunks by hand with an X-Acto knife. Next, for actually mixing and handling the clay on, having a piece of glass is really nice. Usually I just use my glass palette and wash it properly afterwards. To soften it by hand, it's best to chop the clay even smaller, then mix in small batches. Don't mix some, then try to add dry bits to it. It's much harder to then mix those in properly. Mix small amounts, then put those together. Now, softening it with your hands will hurt, so if you can, get a pasta machine that you can pass it through, and that will help a lot. Sculpey sells one, and it's nice that it's stainless steel so it won't rust, but a regular pasta machine will do as well. Now, I've heard conflicting info about polymer clay safety. Supposedly, it's pretty safe, but I would not use the pasta machine or any other kitchen tools for food again without a very thorough cleaning. And again, be careful if your pasta machine isn't stainless steel. It will rust if it doesn't dry properly. After being in storage for a while, this one had rusted from bits of pasta that were stuck inside. I cleaned it, put it back together, but this time I removed the top plates so that it's easier to clean. For actually mixing with the pasta machine, I tend to use the thinnest setting, and it's best to start out with a small bit that you mixed by hand, because otherwise the dry bits tend to fly everywhere if you just pass them through. Flatten that small bit, then lay it across the rollers and add some dry chunks and a bit of softener. Then knead that until it's soft and has no lumps, and repeat until you have enough clay. To make sure it's properly mixed, especially when doing it by hand, it can be useful to mix in a bit of different colored clay if you have some, so then you can tell when it's thoroughly mixed. Now, I would suggest you mix only a bit more than the clay you're going to use, and for storage, I recommend you cut it into long strips like so, or little chunks so it's easier to remove later. I've heard putting it into an airtight container helps prevent it from drying. I'd never really tried it before. I'd always use Ziploc bags and they never worked, so I'll be trying putting them in an airtight container and I'll report back in a few months on the results. Lastly, be sure to wash your hands thoroughly after working with the clay. Now on to baking. I'll stick to baking it normally in the oven, but I just want to mention that there's many different ways to bake polymer clay. Some people boil it, some use a heat gun, some slowly cook it until it's overcooked and hard as a rock. Some vary the temperatures in a subset of overcooking called ramp baking. It all depends on what you have and your needs, so feel free to experiment so long as you don't burn it. Now, I had always been under the impression until recently that you shouldn't cook it in the oven where you cook food, so I had always used these cooking bags used to cook chickens. I put my pieces in there, squeeze out some of the air because if you don't and a piece shifts, it's hard to grab, then twist the bag and clip it closed. Once it's done cooking, I take it outside, take the clip off, careful it'll be hot, and take the sculpture out of the bag if I can. You don't have to. Just try not to breathe the fumes, then leave everything there to cool. Supposedly, though, it's safe to cook it without the bag, but it really smells quite awful. This is much easier than having to ventilate the whole room, especially if you cook a lot. The bag can just be reused over and over again. Now, the recommended temperature is 130 degrees Celsius for Sculpey. Some other types might say 110, but it's okay to mix them and bake at 130. The real danger point is at 175, where it'll burn and release hydrochloride gas. That's quite a large safety margin, but if you want to cook your pieces consistently, note that ovens are rarely calibrated right. Get an oven thermometer if you can, or you can cook it at a lower temperature for longer than suggested. Some ovens, like mine, might not even have such low temperatures. I suspect mine is actually cooler than it says, but if yours is warmer, you can try leaving the door open a bit, or warming up the oven first, then turning it off to actually bake the clay. And yes, you can recook it and work in layers. More on that in the second part. This is it for this part. I hope you found it helpful. If you have any questions, leave a comment. Otherwise, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and be sure to check out my site for the extended blog post.